Not a lot of females are into playing video games up until very recently. It doesn't have to be a statistic, and we've seen it in front of our eyes. Boys were more prone to playing video games and sports, while girls were meant to play with Barbie dolls and dress up. Well, for me, I believe that's just an old gender norm. And I had an older brother growing up, so I was exposed to video games more than the average little girl. And at the ages of 5 or 6 years old, I was also exposed to violent video games. But that never made me a violent person or have any violent tendencies. So today I'm going to show you why there shouldn't be a restriction on violent video games. Before I get started, how many of us have seen, heard, or played any of these games listed? I love them, especially Grand Theft Auto. There is no explanation for why that's considered violent. God of War, it takes place in the ancient times, and you have to kill most of the members. Mortal Kombat, you're against artificial intelligence or a player too, and it basically shows a lot of gore when they're being killed, like a realistic death. And Assassin's Creed, I don't know much about it, but I've seen clips of it, and it's kind of the same concept of God of War. But what makes these video games violent? Well, factors can include profanity, nudity, blood, acts of violence such as fighting and murder, and the usage of weapons. And all of these games have one thing in common, and that's what I just listed. Mortal Kombat was actually so violent, it is the reason why this is such a controversial topic. It basically brought the topic to light. Believe it or not, these violent video games have a benefit for the brain. It helps the brain with controlling emotions. It provides opportunities for people to explore the consequences of violent actions and have their own morals when they're performing these violent acts in the game, and it helps release their stress and anger in the game rather than hurting others in reality. It also uses mind-building skills because you have to do a lot of teamwork, creativity, and strategies when playing these games. And it makes the mind more mature and separates fiction from reality. So players know the difference between virtual violence in context of a game and how to display appropriate behavior in reality. And most gamers report that playing video games, even violent ones, is a way to relieve stress and enjoy playing with friends, just like any other game. So besides the psychological aspects of video games being used, it is also used for the military. In recent years, the military has encouraged many of its soldiers to partake in the thrill of violent video games because even when they're not in duty, it's a way to continue combat training. An example of this is Call of Duty. It is a military game. And this is one of their fictional characters, Ghost, and this is a live action of the game. It's a first-person shooter game, and it's in a war zone. Pretty much, you're a military member, and you fight in combat, and you pick out your guns. And using games to teach military tactics has been a long-standing practice for the U.S. military. And before video games were popularized like this, troops were encouraged to play military-themed board games to continue their combat training. And a war veteran has said that video games can reflect real-life combat situations. So I think this is a good use for violent video games, and having them restricted wouldn't help them. So regarding those two factors, here are some statistics on the violent video games. Past research involving children found that those who played video games that were violent were better with their academics, relationships, social skills, and they were more confident in general. And as the sales of violent video games have increased, juvenile crimes have decreased significantly. And there is not enough statistics to support the claim that violent video games cause mass shootings or violence. And I wanted to talk about this chart right here, the prevalence of violent video games played by mass shooters. A good amount have said yes, but the majority said no. Therefore, you can't really prove that the video games are the reason for their violence. And the reason why this one in 1992 has a good amount is because during this time, there wasn't mass shootings as popular as they are now. But during this time, that's when a lot of these video games were being released left to right, such as Mortal Kombat, Tekken, or even Grand Theft Auto. So with those being at our fingertips constantly during that time, it did provoke a little more violence than it should have. So why shouldn't there be a restriction? As citizens who live in America, we have the freedom of expression, and video games, whether they're violent or not, is one of them. And a game should not be taken away from us by senators or parents. That is our freedom. And the majority of the games that contain violence in them have a rating such as M for mature, or you have to be 18 plus to play, but nobody follows those guidelines. And the video games have always had to blame for the violent behaviors, but that's not necessarily the game's fault, and they have their restrictions and labels for a reason. And the video games are not the main cause of violent behaviors. It's in the player's environment, their learned behaviors firsthand, and their neglected mental health, which is the reason why they have their own violent tendencies. And it cannot be pinpointed back to the video games. And restricting them won't make a difference at all because people will find a loophole to access these games, just like they do with drugs and other contrabands. So in conclusion, there's just not enough evidence to prove that video games are the reason for violence among people. Without the violence in games, it doesn't bring a thrill into play. Even with kids' games, fighting can be considered violent. So if you want to ban kids' games that are like fighting games, then they wouldn't have access to it. And if these games were to get banned, then the video market would crash rapidly because it has its own stock market, and with them being off the shelves, it'll make it unsuccessful, just like any other market, such as fashion or makeup. And without the violence being used in these games, so the most iconic video games would not exist. But before I conclude, I found these 2 quotes on YouTube that I thought I should just share. If Madden doesn't make me a pro football player, Cookie Mama doesn't make me a chef, and a surgeon simulator doesn't make me a licensed doctor, then why would a violent video game make me a violent person? Personally, those games help me relax and deal with violent tendencies. And lastly, one of the quotes that I like, video games don't make you violent, only the lag. And that's it.